Imagine a village where everyone knows everyone. There is no police station, no courtroom, no lawyer, no book telling you what is legal and what is forbidden. And yet somehow the village functions. People know who owns which animals. They know who is expected to marry whom. They know what happens when someone steals. They know which promises matter, which traditions must be respected, and which actions will make the rest of the community turn against you. Nobody needs to read the rules. The rules already exist. They live in memory. They live in custom. They live in reputation, and for thousands of years that may have been enough, until human societies became too large for everyone to know everyone else. That was when one of humanity's quietest inventions began to change the world: law. We often imagine law as something that was invented when the first ruler ordered rules carved into stone, but that is probably not where the story begins. The first laws were likely much less dramatic. They were simply the things a community expected people to do: how disputes were settled, how property was recognized, how marriage worked, how debts were repaid, how violence was punished. In other words, before law became something written down, it was something people already practiced. And that distinction matters, because humans did not suddenly decide one day to invent rules. Humans had rules long before they had law codes. The real problem was figuring out how to make those rules work when the community became too big, too wealthy, and too complicated for memory alone to hold everything together. Small groups have a powerful advantage. Everyone knows who you are. If you injure someone, everybody hears about it. If you break a promise, your reputation follows you. If an elder settles a dispute, the decision can be remembered because there are only so many people involved. Social pressure does a remarkable amount of work, but scale changes everything. Imagine a settlement growing from a few dozen families into hundreds, then thousands. Now the butcher does not necessarily know the farmer. The trader may come from another city. A stranger may arrive carrying valuable goods. Two families may disagree over land neither one personally witnessed being occupied. Someone steals an animal and claims it was never yours. Someone injures another person and the victim's family demands revenge. And suddenly the old system begins to strain. The problem is no longer simply knowing what is right. The problem is making everyone agree on what happens when someone does what is wrong. Because without some shared answer, one dispute can create another. One injury demands revenge. The revenge demands another revenge. And soon a disagreement between two people becomes a conflict between families. This is one of the most dangerous things about a society without predictable rules. Violence does not necessarily end when the original crime ends. It can reproduce itself. A stolen animal leads to an accusation. The accusation leads to a beating. The beating leads to retaliation. The retaliation creates a new victim. Now there are two families with reasons to be angry. The original dispute has disappeared beneath layers of revenge. At some point, a community has to solve a difficult problem. How do you stop people from becoming their own judges? The answer was not discovered all at once. Different societies developed different systems, but eventually some communities began turning customs into more formal rules enforced by recognized authority. This was an enormous change, because now the punishment for an offense did not depend entirely on the anger of the victim. The community could say, "This is the rule, this is what happened, and this is what follows." That sounds simple. It was not. A rule that exists only inside people's memories can change with the person remembering it. One elder may remember the tradition one way, another may remember it differently. A powerful person may interpret the custom in his own favor. And the person with the greatest physical strength has an obvious advantage when there is no higher authority. Writing introduced something new. It could make a rule visible. You could point to it. You could preserve it. You could show it to someone who claimed not to know it. And that is why one of the most important steps in the history of law was not inventing a new punishment. It was writing the existing rules down. Among the most famous examples is the Code of Hammurabi in ancient Mesopotamia. Hammurabi's laws were not humanity's first laws. That distinction is important. The idea of written rules was already older, but Hammurabi's code became famous because it gave a remarkably clear picture of what a large organized society expected from its people. The rules dealt with property, trade, injury, family relationships, labor, and punishment, and the code was publicly displayed. That changed the relationship between people and rules. Law was no longer merely something whispered from one generation to another. It had become something that could stand in public, something permanent enough to look at, something associated with the authority of the state. But there is a deeper reason this mattered. Hammurabi was not governing a tiny village where everyone shared the same background. He ruled a complex and diverse population. People had different occupations, different levels of wealth, different relationships with power. And strangers were increasingly interacting with strangers. A larger society creates opportunities, more trade, more wealth, more specialization. more construction, more administration, but it also creates more ways for people to collide. That is where law becomes more than morality. It becomes infrastructure. A merchant needs to know what happens if a contract is broken. A farmer needs some expectation about property. A family needs rules governing inheritance. A ruler needs a system for settling disputes. And people need to know that another person cannot simply take what belongs to them because he happens to be stronger. Law begins turning uncertainty into predictability. And predictability is incredibly valuable. It allows strangers to cooperate. That may be one of the most important things laws ever accomplished. Imagine two people who have never met. One has goods, the other has money. Neither knows whether the other will keep the agreement. Without some shared expectation of enforcement, the transaction becomes much riskier. With rules, contracts, and consequences, cooperation becomes easier. Law makes trust possible between people who do not personally trust one another. But there is something uncomfortable hidden inside this achievement. The same system that protects people can also control them. The same law that prevents the strong from exploiting the weak can give enormous power to whoever defines the law. And early rulers understood this. A ruler did not merely need people to obey. He needed them to believe that obedience was legitimate. That is why early laws were often connected to sacred authority. If a ruler could present the law as something larger than his personal preference, the rule became harder to challenge. The message was no longer, "I want you to do this." It became, "This is how the world is supposed to work." That is a profound change. Power becomes more stable when it looks like order, rather than personal force. And this is one reason law became intertwined with religion, kingship, and political authority. The ruler was not simply enforcing rules. He could present himself as the guardian of justice itself. Hammurabi's laws were associated with the idea that the ruler was responsible for establishing justice and protecting the vulnerable from oppression. That sounds remarkably modern, but the ancient world was still very far from modern equality. The laws did not necessarily treat every person the same. Social status mattered, gender mattered, economic position mattered. Punishments could differ depending on who committed the offense and who suffered from it. This creates one of the great contradictions in the history of law. Law can restrain power, but law can also formalize inequality. It can protect the weak, and it can define exactly who counts as weak. It can make justice predictable, but predictable injustice is still injustice. That contradiction never disappeared. Instead, it became part of the next stage of the story. Once humans realized that rules could be written, another question emerged: who gets to decide the rules? That question is almost as important as the rules themselves, because the invention of law did not end conflict. It moved the conflict to a new level. People no longer fought only over land, property, or punishment. They could fight over who had the authority to define those things. And as civilizations changed, their legal systems changed with them. In the ancient Mediterranean world, Roman law developed over centuries. One important milestone was the Law of the 12 Tables, created in the 5th century BCE. Its importance was not simply that rules existed. Rules already existed. The significance was that legal principles could be made more publicly accessible within a society where disputes over power and rights were becoming increasingly important. Again, the central problem was predictability. If the rules are hidden inside tradition, the people interpreting them hold enormous power. Make the rules visible, and interpretation becomes harder to monopolize. Not impossible, but harder. Over time, legal traditions became more complicated. Courts developed procedures. Jurists interpreted old rules. Governments created new rules. Older principles were adapted to new circumstances. And eventually, in medieval England, a different legal tradition began developing through the King's Court. This became the foundation of what we now call common law. Notice what has happened. Law began as custom. Then custom became formalized. Formal rules were written down. Written rules had to be interpreted. Interpretation created institutions. Institutions created traditions. And those traditions could generate new rules without somebody sitting down and inventing an entirely new legal system from scratch. Law had become something that could evolve. That may be one of its strangest features. Human beings invented laws, but once laws became embedded in institutions, those institutions began shaping human behavior in return. A rule changes what people do. What people do creates new social expectations. Those expectations influence future rules. The system begins feeding itself. And this is where law stops looking like a list of punishments and starts looking like a technology, not a machine made of metal, a social technology, a system designed to coordinate millions of human decisions. Think about what happens when a society has no predictable rule for ownership. Every piece of property becomes a possible dispute. If contracts cannot be enforced, long-distance trade becomes much harder. If inheritance has no recognized structure, every death can become a political crisis. If violence is settled entirely through revenge, conflicts can continue across generations. Law does not eliminate human selfishness. It gives society a way to manage it. That distinction matters. Humans did not become peaceful because they invented law. They remained human. They still wanted more land, more wealth, more power, more status. They still became jealous. They still lied. They still betrayed one another. The achievement was creating systems that could absorb some of that conflict without allowing every disagreement to become a private war. And once those systems existed, societies could become larger. Cities could support strangers. Markets could connect distant regions. Governments could administer territory. People could specialize in professions that required them to depend on thousands of others they would never meet. Law became part of the invisible structure holding all of this together. You rarely think about that structure because it works in the background. When you buy something online, you assume there are rules governing payment and ownership. When you sign a contract, you assume the agreement means something. When someone damages your property, you assume there is a system for resolving the dispute without requiring you to gather your relatives and settle it personally. That assumption is extraordinary. It is also ancient. The stone tablets are gone from everyday life. The king is gone. The original dispute may be forgotten. But the basic problem remains. How do people who do not trust one another cooperate anyway? Law is one answer. And perhaps that explains why this invention appeared in so many different human societies. The details were different. The punishments were different, the institutions were different, the moral assumptions were different, but the underlying problem kept returning. Human communities grew. Relationships became more complicated. Strangers interacted. Resources had to be allocated. Conflicts became too large for personal revenge to handle safely. And people needed predictable answers. That is why the history of law is not really the history of a single invention. It is the history of humans repeatedly solving the same problem at larger and larger scales. First a family, then a village, then a city, then a kingdom, then an empire. Then eventually societies containing millions of people who will never meet. The rules had to grow with them, and every time they did, the rules created a new question. Who is protected? Who is excluded? Who writes the rules? Who interprets them? Who enforces them? And what happens when the law itself becomes unjust? Those questions are still unresolved. That is the strange thing about an invention that is thousands of years old. We still use it every day. But perhaps the most important part of law is not the punishment written at the bottom of a page. It is the invisible agreement underneath it. The idea that tomorrow does not have to be decided by whoever is strongest today. The idea that a dispute can have an answer other than revenge. The idea that a stranger can make a promise to another stranger and expect the promise to mean something. The idea that power itself can be placed inside a system of rules. That was the deeper revolution. Humans did not invent law because people suddenly became good. They invented increasingly sophisticated laws because people remained complicated. They needed a way to live together despite their differences, rivalries, ambitions, and fears. The first rules may have sounded ordinary. Do not steal, keep your promises, respect property, settle disputes, accept consequences. But over thousands of years, those ordinary expectations grew into something enormous. They became courts, contracts, governments, legal traditions, rights, institutions. Entire civilizations organized around the assumption that human behavior could be governed by rules rather than pure force. And the next time you see a law written in a book, posted on a wall, or buried inside a contract that you barely read, it is worth remembering what sits underneath those words. Before there were courtrooms, there were customs. Before there were law books, there were memories. Before there were governments enforcing rules, there were communities trying to prevent one person's anger from becoming everybody else's problem. The invention of law was not the moment humans discovered how to control one another. It was the much longer moment when humans discovered that a society could be held together by something more durable than personal power, a shared rule, a rule that could outlive the person who created it. And perhaps that is what makes law one of humanity's strangest inventions. We built it to control behavior. Then it began shaping civilization.